the pleasure of life, the good things of life, the goodness of life. Do you experience good, even in the context of hardship, the context of adversity, or even in the context of fear, danger? That is what Psalm 16 is about. Now, there's a messianic element to this psalm, but we're studying the 16th psalm. And so welcome to studying it with me. I mentioned before, we're going to work on memorizing this psalm also. But this is what David is referring to. This is a psalm of David, and it is messianic, so there's a prophetic element to it, where it is fulfilled in Christ, where he can experience all the goodness of life, even through the deep adversity that he experienced. And David experienced a lot of adversity too. But how do we experience the goodness of life as we take refuge in God? He says in the first two verses, and you can recite it with me if you're memorizing it, "Preserve me, O God, for in you I take refuge. I say to the Lord, you are my Lord. Apart from you, I have no good." What an amazing statement. And what he is affirming there is God is my refuge when he is my master and my highest good. I have no good above you. There's no greater good than you. And then he says, I say to the Lord, Jehovah, Yahweh, you are my Adonai, my master. So when God is my master, when he is my highest good, only then can I take refuge in him and experience good, even in the context of hardship, fear, and adversity. So as he continues that, because he will end this psalm in terms of talking about our highest good, our greatest pleasure, as he continues in this pursuit of what is good in life. He continues, as he says in verse 3, "As for the saints in the land, they are the excellent ones in whom is all my delight." Another factor in the pleasure of life, or the goodness of life, is the company you keep. God created us for community. What is the makeup of your community? Hopefully it's something a little more than virtual community. The saints, he says, as for the saints in the land, the saints is the Hebrew word kedoshim. It means God's people, his chosen people, the people who have a shared faith, a shared object of trust, people who have a shared identity, people who have a shared mission and purpose in life. And these are the ones as described by God way back in Deuteronomy 7 and verse 6. He says, "For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth." That is a reference that Peter made in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. "For you are a chosen generation, a holy people, a royal priesthood." And that is what God thinks of his people. That's who we are. So David is referring to God's people in the same fashion. As for the saints in the land, they are the excellent ones. And that word excellent is a word that means nobles, people who are looked up to. How it's the same word in Psalm 8, "How excellent is your name." I look up to your name. Your name is mighty. It carries the sense of might, of being mighty. And so as David refers to the saints in the land, he's seeking the good of life. A life that can be described as a life that has pleasure, even in adversity and difficulty and hardship. The good of life. The company you keep, the people of God. And he says, the saints in the land, these are the excellent ones in whom is all my delight. In other words, what he's saying, these are people whose lives are weighty in my life. These are people who impact my life. These are my heroes. These are the people that I want to be like. So I delight in them. These are the things he's saying. So I want to keep company with these people because that is the good of life, the good company of people who also know and love and follow God. That is good. And that's why in Psalm 101 in verse 6, as we've studied before on Sunday morning, David says, I will look with favor on the faithful in the land, that they may dwell with me. He who walks with me in the way that is blameless shall minister to me. So it's referring to those who have that common faith, that common identity, that common purpose and mission in God, in Christ, where we speak into each other's lives, we walk with each other. That's all that fellowship is. Sharing what we have in common. That is the good of life. And David understood that. That's what he's proclaiming right here. And then he brings us to a very sharp contrast to that in verse 4. He says, the sorrows of those who run after another god shall multiply. So much that we could say about that, but that is a fundamental truth. Why? Because God is our creator. He is the very point to our existence. And so the sorrows of those who run after another god shall multiply. Basically just saying this, every other basis of hope is certain to disappoint. Whatever other basis of hope you have other than God and His purpose and His promise, that basis of hope other than God's is certain to disappoint. And it will disappoint exponentially, according to verse 4. That's why I've said before, one's want or satisfaction is relative to the nearness of God. Remember what David said, probably his most famous words, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. So true that is, and that's what he is affirming in this psalm. I have, apart from you, I have no good. My delight is in your people who will follow you faithfully, who reflect your character and your purpose. That is the good that you have for me. Now, one might say, Rich, are you saying that there are unbelievers that cannot experience any good or pleasure in life? I'm not saying that at all. We all experience the common grace of God. You can be an unbeliever and still experience community. You can be an unbeliever and still experience God's gifts because every good thing comes from God. The problem is, for people who are unbelievers, they're enjoying God's things, but they're not enjoying God. And see, that will run out. That will run out, and that being the case, their happiness is fleeting, and it's only for a season. But the existential questions and the transcendent truths, they have to ignore them. They can only suppress them at best. They can be distracted from them. But that will run out. There is no ultimate answer after that. And so their happiness, their joy, the goodness of life is going to come to a very abrupt end at some point. But not for David. It goes on forever. And that's what he is affirming in this psalm. He says, I will not share in their worship. Those who do not acknowledge God, I will not share in their worship, because the things that they worship are their objects of trust and satisfaction, and I will not participate in that. They might be good things, but I do not look to those good things for my identity, for my satisfaction, for my security, because that belongs only to God. And when I can say that, that's when I truly experience and enjoy the good of life. Because if there is something good and I look to that for my security and my satisfaction, then I become bent and obsessed with protecting it and possessing it. And then I can't really enjoy it. But David knew that his highest good was God. The saints in the land were his delight. He says in Psalm 63, verse 8, my soul follows close to you, or my soul clings to you. Do you see the relationship there? You see the imagery? My soul follows close to you. God, I am with you. I want to be with you. I want to keep company with you. I want to know and practice your presence. But not only his presence, as he speaks of what is good, of what is delightful, of what he takes in delight in. It's not only God, but also God's people. God's people are such an important element to my good that God has for me. We can learn something from Greek mythology here to some degree. I want to be careful with that, but this is very interesting. In Greek mythology, ancient sailors, and I'm borrowing this from Craig Troxell, With All Your Heart, the book he wrote, With All Your Heart, Orienting Your Mind, Desires, and Will Toward Christ. It was published this year in 2020. And he says, in Greek mythology, ancient sailors faced many dangers at sea. One of the most unusual was that of the sirens, who used their mesmerizing songs to lure sailors to their deaths on the rocky shores. 2 famous Greeks were able to sail by them successfully. One was Odysseus, who stopped up the ears of his men with wax, and then he had his men tie him to the ship's mast. This way his men were safe, and he was able to hear the sirens' sweet song with relatively little harm. The other was the legendary Orpheus. He was sailing with Jason and the Argonauts. As they approached the sirens and began to hear the sirens' voices drift across the water, Orpheus took out his lyre and began to sing an even more charming melody to the men. Like Odysseus, we can restrict our bodies, being tied to the mast, or limit access to temptation, putting wax in our ears. But in the end, like Orpheus, the holy desires of our hearts must rise and conquer. The desire to love and follow Jesus must be a sweeter song to us than the music of the world and our flesh. What a profound truth that is. And this is what David is affirming of God and his delight in God's people. That's where I find good. Therein, I find and experience and enjoy the pleasures of life and its pleasure everlasting. And so we see then the necessity of Christian community. This is what David is affirming, godly community. We need the church. God's people need each other. Hebrews 10 talks about being in company with each other to provoke one another to love and good deeds. That's a chief function of the church. Part of following Jesus is helping others follow Jesus. But also, if I am to say, this is what John points out, the Apostle John, if I am to love God, if I say I love God, then it follows that I love those who are born of God. John says this very clearly, 1 John 5, verses 1 and 2. It's a family love. If I am a part of God's family and they're a part of God's family, then we share the love of God. We share a common love for God. We share God's love, and that means we love each other. You see that family bond there. We need each other as the people of God. That important element of Christian community, I think Max Lucado points it out very well, even in the context of adversity and danger. He says in his book, Fearless, he says, questions can make hermits out of us, driving us into hiding, yet the cave has no answers. Christ distributes courage through community. He dissipates doubts through fellowship. He never deposits all knowledge in one person, but distributes pieces of the jigsaw puzzle to many. When you interlock your understanding with mine, and we share our discoveries, when we mix, mingle, confess, and pray, Christ speaks. It's a good description of the function of the church. We need each other. And the good of life that we are going to experience that God has for us comes in the company, our company with God and our company with his people. The pleasure of life is in the company you keep. Practice the presence of God and his people. We need each other. And in that we will see the dawn of a new day where his mercies are new every morning. and we will find that his pleasures are fresh every day. Psalm 16, we've covered verses 1 through 4. I hope you take refuge in God. I hope you find the goodness that he has for you in himself, as he is your master, your highest good, and you delight in God and in his people. May God bless you.